Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Latest, the official podcast of the Brock Press, where we take you beyond the headlines and do a deep dive into some of the many interesting articles written by our team this week. My name is Noah Nickel. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brock Press and host of The Latest, and today I'm joined by, as always, our managing editor, Holly Morrison, and also, for the first time, one of our sports and wellness editors, Liam Nielsen. How are you both doing?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be making my debut on the pod today. Day's off to a great start. I guessed my Wordle on the third try today, so hopefully it's all smooth sailing from here on out.
I think that's a sign of great things to come. I'm also doing good. Day's off to a good start. Got up early today, so we're doing good.
Yeah, me too. I was up at 9:30. That is bright and early for me. If anyone knows how much I hate waking up early. And also, 3 on Wordle is probably the best score you could get without it being luck. We're ringing in reading week with a very busy week here at Brock. There's a lot going on in the world, but we are here to talk about at least some of it. The first thing that kicked off this week was the Rams' big win at the Super Bowl. Also, the Olympics have been continuing this whole time, and some of the discourse around that has kind of gotten the gutter, which we will also be talking about. And lastly, there was actually a settlement reached in a class action lawsuit against Airbnb that will see users of the site, people who have rented through there, receiving credits over the next few months. So all of that is coming up next. So with that, we'll get right into it.
Okay, so we'll start things off with the Super Bowl, like Noah mentioned. So I wrote about that this week. It was the last in a long line of notes from the NFL columns that I've been writing throughout the year that I know our non-sport-centric folks on the staff team have really loved editing. I know that for a fact. But it was a pretty good game, I think, all things considered. The Rams kind of jumped out to a hot start, taking a 13-3 lead early on. Bengals scored a touchdown before halftime. Then we had, the star-studded halftime show that everyone's talking about in LA. Bengals really had a great stretch in the beginning of the third quarter with the first play, 75-yard touchdown, and then an interception leading to another field goal, and the Rams were able to close it out. So I have a lot of thoughts on sort of the outcome itself and sort of how the Rams built their team and sort of some big picture thoughts on the season and going forward. But I mean, first of all, I want to ask, so I'm a big football fan. I watch probably, I would say, 75% of the games this year. But what are your folks' relationship with the Super Bowl? Did you watch it this year? Do you typically watch? What does that look like for you usually?
I did not watch this year. I am not a big football person. It's just not one of the sports that I follow. I think mostly because when I was in high school, my family really liked football, and it wasn't cool to like anything that my family liked, so I never got into it. But I usually do watch at least the Super Bowl just to sort of know what's going on, what everyone's talking about. It's like a fun, big event. But on Sunday, I had a big sports sponsorship paper due, so I was doing that instead, and then I just kind of forgot that the Super Bowl was happening until it was like already halfway through, so I was like, what is the point in turning it on? And yeah, did not watch, wasn't really that engaged with it this year, if I'm being honest.
This was probably my most engaged year of football ever, which is not a high bar at all. I'm not a sports fan. Nothing necessarily against sports, just not really my bag, but football would be the most closest to something I enjoy and even somewhat keep up with. Most of my knowledge is limited to Liam's column, which as a non-sports fan I actually have enjoyed. I think you were being sarcastic in your intro, but I did enjoy every notes in the NFL column and learned quite a bit. And so I've watched a handful of games here and there during the regular season. Playoffs I watched a little bit more, and then I watched the Super Bowl with a couple of my friends, and we enjoyed it. But I've always watched the Super Bowl since I was really little. Since I can remember, I've pretty much seen all of them because we were going through, the past halftime shows, and I was remembering a fair amount of them up until like 2007. So it's been just like a random thing that we do. It's not like a big deal. My dad's a fan of football, but it's not like be all or end all, really. So I don't know. It's just kind of been a tradition of something we watch when February rolls around.
Well, that's good to know. I always like, because I'm, so ingrained in the sports world, and, I spend so much of my time consuming sports content and watching games pretty much every single day. Every night I get home and there's always something to watch, but it's always easy to forget for me that many, many, many people have different relationships to sports than I do. So it's always kind of good to hear from the other side on that. But Noah, you mentioned the halftime show. I wanted to get into that a little bit. I unfortunately did not catch the halftime show live because I was playing host and making nachos for everyone that was at my house. So I had to miss it, unfortunately. But I did catch it on replay. What were your thoughts on that whole thing with, Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, Kendrick, Mary J. Blige, Eminem, a little cameo from 50 Cent? How was that for you?
Well, on top of not being the biggest football fan, I'm not the biggest rap or hip hop fan at all. But even I knew almost every single song that was played, and frankly enjoyed the entire thing. It was a lot of fun. It had a great energy while you, like, just continuing to watch it throughout the game. Like it fit really, really nicely right in the middle there to get, everyone just riled up for the second half. One of the better ones, I would say, in recent years, certainly, leaps and bounds ahead of The Weeknd, in my opinion. Nothing against The Weeknd. He actually has a lot of good music, a lot more music closer to my personal taste, but not fitting with the Super Bowl environment, if you ask me. And I don't know if that's a commonly held belief, but I just, kind of lost me last year. But anyways, back to this year, much, much better, much more fitting with being in LA, and much more fitting with the, football environment. 50 Cent's cameo was hilarious. Him hanging from the ceiling like the old music video, that was really funny. And all the memes that came after that. Anderson .Paak also had a little cameo there on drums that a lot of people missed, but I'm definitely a big fan of him. He's really impressive, prolific producer, an important music figure today. But anyways, yeah, really great. Curious your thoughts having watched it after the fact.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, actually, on your point about The Weeknd, I wholeheartedly agree. I think the lineup this year definitely fit a lot better for the football Super Bowl environment. I will say what I thought was missing from this year was just the production value and sort of the stage presence. I mean, last year with The Weeknd, it was a spectacle. He was going through the Mac Chown-esque mirror maze and out on the field, just littered with all the dancers. I'd have to go back and watch and see exactly what he was doing, but it did feel like that was more of a spectacle, a production than this year. But I think what really got this year kind of over that hump was, the nostalgia for one, and then a lot of the artists' relationship to LA, specifically to the host city, I think is a really important thing to keep in mind as well. But I think the nostalgia piece is what really drove that, and I think we're seeing that more and more as we become the audience. Us as coming into our early to mid 20s, we're starting to become the audience that the nostalgia is being catered towards, which is a little scary, a little jarring, I would say. But it reminds me of something in the non-sports world of like the new Spider-Man movie, right? Bringing back Tobey Maguire. He was the guy that we grew up on as kids. And then, look who the people who love that movie the most. They're everyone that's our age, right? So I think it's sort of a similar concept going on there with the Super Bowl halftime show, if that makes any sense. I don't know. It's any other, either of you think of any other like recent examples of like, really pandering towards the mid-20s crowd that grew up on early 2000s products, or am I rambling, or what do you think about that?
I think that's a newly emergent thing. It's probably only going to get, not worse, but just more prevalent. Well, I guess worse depending on who you talk to, but more prevalent. as time goes on. But you caught me with your comment about the production value, which I understand and can agree to a certain extent. But I think that their stage setup was deceptively simple. But I mean, there was a lot of movement and different staging and a lot of extras, honestly. A lot of choreography that was meant to look kind of improvised, but was very intricate because there's just so many so many people in so many different areas on stage and kind of interacting and intersecting with each other. The only thing that kind of stuck out to me a little bit was that, if Kendrick Lamar was able to, headline the halftime show himself, I think he would have done something more Weekend-esque, because his kind of segment was the most reminiscent to me of that kind of more grandiose style. But I mean, for the most part, the vast majority of halftime shows kind of more so lean on this side when you look at the history. They tend to just be more focused on artists playing the hits, and usually it pays off, pretty well. But yeah, I thought this one was pretty solid. But I know there's a lot of other ones in the past. So, Holly, since you haven't had a chance to comment, are there any that have stuck out to you that you might have watched that you've enjoyed?
Well, the halftime show, I usually would end up tuning it out. Honestly, whenever my family would watch the Super Bowl, I would end up tuning most of it out. So, the one, and this is not the best one, I know this by far, the one that stands out to me is the one that Coldplay did, just because there were so many colors and it was in the afternoon, and that was kind of unusual. And I thought that was fun. That one had a sort of weird production value. I think I remember Beyonce. I definitely remember The Weeknd. But yeah, I do not remember any of them super well. But yeah, they definitely seem like they lean on artists, and it does usually seem like at some point every artist is and it's me, Beyonce, headlining the halftime show, but also here's someone else that I'm gonna bring out. So it does kind of usually feel like there are those celebrity cameos to make people go, oh my god, it's them. But yeah, I actually haven't even seen this year's halftime show on replay. That is how out of the loop I am about this year's Super Bowl.
All right. Well, today I learned that Coldplay performed at the Super Bowl halftime show. I guess I just completely blocked that out of my memory. Usually I would say the halftime show is kind of bottom priority for me. Just I'm kind of focused on the actual game itself and figuring out what's going on the field. But, I always do end up catching the halftime show and things like that. I think the J-Lo and Shakira one from a few years ago was really good. That one stands out in recent memory. But, yeah, it's good to know. Maybe I'll go back and watch some of the old halftime shows and try and do a little bit of a deep dive. But and going back to The Weeknd just one last time, I didn't think that was necessarily the best halftime show, Noah, like you were saying. I just thought I was impressed with the spectacle, but I think that's probably also why there was so much backlash on it. I remember people not liking it at the time, and I think it was because he tried to do something that was so different from all the typical halftime shows that you were mentioning. So it's something to keep in mind as well. But getting away from the halftime show, I think the other big part of the Super Bowl is the ads. So any of the ads stand out to either of you this year? I don't know, Holly, maybe you caught something on social media afterwards, or Noah, you catch anything in real time during the commercials that jumped out?
I was because I was writing a paper, so I was on Twitter more often than I was writing the paper, but I did see people reacting to the ads. Was there an absurd amount of ads for crypto? Because that is all I saw anyone talking about.
There's been crypto ads I think there's been an uptick in them over the last year, especially on during sports programming, in the commercials. There's a Matt Damon crypto ad that's pretty big right now. That's getting memed all over the place. But yeah, crypto, the Quest trade ads are a big one as well. So a lot of financial driven stuff there. I saw a really good tweet. I can't remember who it was from exactly, but I mean, I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on crypto. But I heard somebody say it's hard for me to believe that cryptocurrency is real money because you don't ever see ads for money. Was basically the tweet. So I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, now I want to see ads for like Canadian currency. Get it? Like it's just gonna. It is
Go get your
ridiculous.
$20 bill today.
It's funny when you think of it that way.
Yeah, puts it into perspective.
I don't like that they're using athletes are pushing this stuff, and I don't necessarily blame athletes. I get that they want to kind of capitalize, and if that's the offer on the table, then like I get it. But I mean, I think people need a little bit of discretion to realize that this is kind of tough stuff to be putting your name to, right? And so often there's so often I hear as like a non-sports person per se that the that it's on athletes to kind of live a life off the field or outside of the game that is upstanding because they have fans who are children and impressionable and whatever. But if they're hawking cryptocurrency, I think that's worse than them getting caught like using drugs or something in their personal time. But I don't know, maybe that's just me.
I mean, from a sport management perspective, and maybe Holly can jump in on this one as well as a fellow SPEMA major. I know, athletes often have clauses even built into their contracts, basically called like loyalty clauses and things like that. So just ensuring that they have good behavior off the field, off the ice, off the court, whatever it may be. And I do wonder when the leagues will try and draw the line and say, hey, don't advertise crypto or NFTs or things like that, because these things, like, I don't know too much about them, but they seem like a very inaccessible financial venture. Like I don't think the common Joe Schmo can just go out and buy an NFT. Like I think you need to have like a lot of money, right? From what I know. So at what point do the leagues sort of step in and say, hey, stop advertising this stuff and stop striking sponsorship deals with this? But Holly, did you have any like input on that? Any thoughts?
Yeah, like it's one of those weird things because like rich people seem to love crypto, and I think that like that kind of includes teams and leagues. Like it's not happening so much in North American sports yet, but there are a lot of European sports like leagues and teams that have like official crypto partners, which I find mind-boggling and baffling and freaking insane because, like you said, nobody would be like, and let's put the logo for a euro on these like soccer kits, but they'll do that for like crypto.com. So I don't even know if like teams and leagues would want to step in because it like right now it makes so much money, but it seems kind of like in the same way that in the early 2000s everyone had like a .com ad partnership, sponsorship, whatever. And then it kind of just like disappeared and that sort of bubble burst. I feel like it's going to be the same kind of thing where everyone is like, oh my God, everyone's got to get an NFT and get into crypto. And then it's going to backfire insanely. So I think like long term, it's definitely irresponsible for like athletes and leagues and teams to sort of be like hawking this stuff, but I don't think they're going to stop anytime soon because it does make them so much money. Real money, not crypto.
Yeah, that is something I think you always probably have to remember as well, is as much as teams and leagues can, put out the front that they're all about, athlete empowerment and corporate social responsibility, it's really the profit at the end of the day. And we saw that recently. The Staples Center, which has been called the Staples Center since the late 90s, is no longer called the Staples Center in Los Angeles. It's now the Crypto.com Arena. And Crypto.com paid $700 million for the naming, just the naming rights to that stadium. It's not like they're even like, an official sponsor of the teams that play in there. It's not like they did like this big renovation on the stadium. It's just simply to have the stadium named Crypto.com Arena, $700 million. So I think that's a really good point, Holly. Like, you will see teams and leagues just profiting on all of this stuff while they can.
On a totally related to that note, but unrelated to this conversation, I think that's the worst name ever. I think I didn't even, until Crypto.com was like, until that became news that they were going to like take over the naming of that stadium, I had not put it together that Staples Center was like Staples, like the store. Like, it just, to me, it had always just flown or kind of just gone together, like had a nice flow to it in the name, that I had not even like put it together that what the brand was, even though I know what Staples, like I've shopped at Staples many times, but I just didn't make the connection just because it was, the name just sounded good to me. I don't know. It's just, Crypto.com just does not have that same ring to it at all.
You're definitely not alone on that. I had always like just seen Staples Center as Staples Center. I didn't associate it with Staples, the stationery store, really. And like you know, I've been to Staples. I've been there, you know, plenty of times in my life. But when I thought of Staples Center, I thought of the arena, not the brand Staples. And I think, you know, similar thing, probably to a lesser degree, with the old Air Canada Center in Toronto. Like, I saw that as the ACC. I didn't really necessarily associate it with Air Canada, the airline. Whereas I think there's a lot more jarring names that are coming out now, like Crypto.com Arena. That's not becoming synonymous with the LA Lakers or the LA Kings. It's just blatantly in your face cryptocurrency. You know, that's not going to be ingrained with the teams itself, or maybe it will be, I'm not sure. But they also are refusing to call it the Crypt as a nickname. Apparently Crypto.com is not allowing that, but that makes it a little better. I think the Crypt, that's kind of a cool name, right?
I can see why they don't want that, but but it
There's
does
a bit of a
definitely have a better ring. The ring is there when you call it the Crypt, but yeah, I can see why they don't want that.
Any last thoughts on the Super Bowl, maybe the game itself? We talked a lot about sort of the ancillary stuff surrounding the event, but any thoughts on the actual game? Noah or Holly, any big picture thoughts on Super Bowls of years past you want to share?
I think as someone who did not watch and was trying to figure out who won just from like being on social media and not Googling it, it felt like everybody wanted the Bengals to win and nobody wanted the Rams to win. That was my general takeaway, because after nobody was talking about anything, so I was like, the team that no one was cheering for must have won, and in fact they did. And that was my Super Bowl experience this year.
No, that's a really good point. It's something I wanted to bring up, actually. I don't think it was quite as egregious as last or in the AFC Championship, where the Bengals played the Chiefs, who are mostly hated because of Patrick Mahomes' TikTok starring family that people seem not to like. But Joe Burrow, the quarterback of the Bengals, he's developed such a following and a admiration, I think, especially among young fans, and it's turned into a thing where he's basically, his persona has eclipsed the actual team in a sense. So I think everyone was sort of rooting for Joe Burrow just because, you know, he's a cool guy. He wears really nice outfits. He's got the shades. He smokes cigars after in the locker room. He says funny things in press conferences. So I think that also just goes to show how important it is to have somebody marketable like that at the center of your team. But Noah, do you have any thoughts on that?
I thought that was kind of funny because my Super Bowl party of 1, 2, 3, 4, like 6 of us. It's not really a party, but a Super Bowl watching group of people. All of us were cheering for the Rams because of how annoying Burrows is, and his whole persona is just kind of nauseating. But I think that's because, you know, I'm kind of an old person at heart, and so I surround myself with somewhat similar people. So I think that might have more to do with it. But yeah, we were all cheering for the Rams. And, you know, there's a lot of talk that the this was not going to compete with some of the much like incredibly high energy and high stakes and nail biter games in the playoffs. But I thought it was a really good time. I thought it was low scoring, which some people find to be less interesting, but I think it just made the stakes higher in the end. It was a tight game all the way through, and there was a couple key moments that were really got everyone excited, like right at the start of the third, as you mentioned, Liam, that huge, what'd you say, 75-yard touchdown?
Yeah, 75 yards up the sideline.
Mhm.
Should have been called back. There was a pretty bad penalty on the play that wasn't called, but definitely electrifying for sure.
Yeah, there's enough moments that I think definitely didn't eclipse some of those bigger playoff games, but it wasn't. Everyone was saying it was going to be boring because those were so good, but I definitely don't think it was a bad game in the end. I think it was still quite a bit of fun to watch in the moment.
No, I agree. I thought it was a pretty good Super Bowl. I thought the season in general has been one of the best ones in recent memory. And in terms of just recent Super Bowls, I would say this is the best one since probably 2017. If you remember that Philadelphia Eagles Super Bowl, they throw the trick play to Nick Foles, beat the Patriots, beat Tom Brady. I think it's probably the best game since then. But yeah, I think it was a really good game overall. Had an exciting halftime show. I want to give one shout out to the ad. I can't actually remember what brand it was for, but it was for one of the car companies, and it had the actress that played Meadow Soprano on The Sopranos, and it was basically a recreation of The Sopranos intro, driving through New Jersey and stuff like that. I thought that was really cool. Again, probably more pandering just for the nostalgia, but shout out to that ad. I really like that one too. I guess that wraps it up on the Super Bowl conversation here. Any last notes, any comments you folks wanted to add on Super Bowl related things? Any hot takes for next year? Who do you think maybe is going to be the halftime performer next year?
I have my only Super Bowl prediction is that they're gonna get Taylor Swift to perform the literal second that her Coca-Cola contract is up, because she is sponsored by Coca-Cola, but I know that they want her to perform, and that would be probably the biggest nostalgia halftime show. People would hate it, some people would love it, but that is my prediction, that she will do it the literal second that contract expires.
That's why she's never done it. That makes a lot of sense.
I mean, if you want nostalgia, I think that's a big draw for sure. I also didn't know that that's why she hasn't done it, but it makes total sense. I want to see someone really old coming in here. I know this would be good for Noah. I know you're into the classic rock stuff, but give me Elton John or something at the Super Bowl halftime show. Maybe he did it way back in the day, but give me someone like him. Maybe he can perform with Lil Nas X on stage at halftime. I know they have the Uber Eats commercials going now. I'm now realizing, considering how many commercials I know, that I probably need to limit my sports watching because I know way, way, way too many commercials. It's a little frightening, so I'm gonna sit with that one for a bit.
As far as I know, as the resident classic rock enjoyer, I don't think Elton John has done it. But and this isn't necessarily a knock on him or anything, but kind of the trend I see, I have a list here of the Super Bowl performances. And the time when him and his contemporaries, and even people older than him, were performing was 15 years ago. Some of them even almost 20 years ago. I think he's beyond the point just at his age, and it's not him specifically. I think it kind of goes for a lot of people that they could really be a major part of a high energy and fun halftime show without risking damage to the reputation. So I think he would have to be a featured performer, or others of his age, I think similarly would have to essentially come out for a single song or something like that. Sadly, as you said, I'm a big fan of that era of music, but I think a lot of them are past the point of giving a Super Bowl halftime performance, sadly.
Yeah, that's probably a better role for him just as a supporting piece at this stage in his career. But I would definitely like to see like a lineup similar to what they had this year of just kind of like classic rock artists. I think that would be really cool to see.
Okay, so speaking of sports, this is what you get when there are two Speedo Rangers on the podcast. I wrote about sports this week. I wrote about the Olympics. I have been watching a lot of the Olympics. I think as is my right as a sport management major. But yeah, so I watched the Olympics. One of the sort of things that I have seen, though, coming out of just the way that people talk about the Olympics is that, like, all of the venues and all of the things that are happening in Beijing are getting this weird, like, dystopian label. So people just sort of seeing things like, there was this picture of, like, a server, and they were wearing, like, a whole lot of, like, personal protective equipment, obviously because COVID. And someone just snapped a picture, and they were like, that's so dystopian. And I was kind of like, what? Them, like, having the safety equipment to do their jobs. But what I wrote about specifically was the Big Air venue, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's like a skiing and snowboarding thing. You jump really high and do some flips. It's pretty cool. But basically it was being held in front of a decommissioned steel factory, and it looked a little bit like a nuclear power plant. It just looked very industrial, so a lot of people ended up referring to it as dystopian and, you know, just like a weird... To me, at least, what I wrote about is how it's sort of emblematic of the way that Western countries talk about China, and especially the IOC's decision to allow them to host the games. There seems to be kind of a double standard there. So I guess I just wanted to ask you guys, have you been watching the Olympics? Have you noticed any of this kind of discourse, rhetoric about China and the venues?
I've not been really watching the Olympics all that much. I'm ashamed to say it because, you know, when I was a kid, it felt like the Olympics were something to look forward to every couple years. You watch, you know, every event. I remember when I was a kid, I would sit down and I would watch hours of like biathlon or skeet shooting or, you know, luge or skeleton, just all kinds of these random events that I had no idea what was actually going on. But this year, I mean, I've caught a little bit of the skiing, I've caught a little bit of hockey, but other than that, not too much. I do think that the time zones really doesn't help either. Similar issue last Summer Olympics in Tokyo. It's just hard to watch things either really, really early in the morning or really late at night. It's just not necessarily lining up with our viewing patterns. But back to what your sort of article was all about originally, the sort of whole dystopian thing. I do think that word has been adopted into the discourse a lot in recent years, and I think it's thrown around probably a little too liberally, like you were mentioning, like just because something looks a little odd doesn't make it dystopian necessarily. So I think that has something to do with it. But Noah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
I wish I had really interesting thoughts on this, but I just don't really care for the Olympics that much. It's weird. The time that it was hosted in Canada was such a weird time. I don't know about YouTube, but that would be a lie. It was the second Olympics that I was like aware of. I remember watching Beijing the first time, not this one, in 2008, or well, maybe that's not the first time. I'm not totally sure, but that time, I remember watching that one. Obviously too young for the political discussion, and also we didn't have the internet around in the same way we do today, so it wasn't, I feel, as big of a discussion at that time, although it very well could have been. But yeah, it kind of came around to it at that point, and then obviously when it was hosted in Canada, you know, that was a huge deal. We were watching it in classes. I remember in like the library always had a stream going, and we watched that a lot in school even. So I remember that one a lot. But since then, I have not really engaged with the Olympics much at all. This one is coming at an interesting time. And I do think that, and Holly, you mentioned this too, that there's absolutely legitimate concern and criticism to having the games hosted in Beijing. But definitely that is being used as an excuse to say a lot of other stuff. And for a lot of people who really don't know why it's an issue that it's hosted in Beijing to come up with whatever reason they want for it to be an issue. And yeah, that comes off as problematic at best, and in some cases kind of blatantly racist towards Chinese people and towards China, and unfair to the country for sure. But yeah, I think that comes more from people's ignorance to things, right? Not maybe having heard that people are upset that it's being hosted here, or maybe even hearing about diplomatic boycotts of the Olympics, but then not following through, not really understanding what that means. And no, the reason that the Olympics and people are questionable about it being hosted in China is not because their servers have PPE at restaurants.
Yeah, it's kind of just the way that people are talking about it does feel very like reductive and simplistic. I think when like we talked about the article as I was writing it, I think what I said was like that I've noticed that a lot of the criticism just sort of comes down to people going like China bad, just because that's what people in Western nations are kind of taught to believe. Like it happened a little bit to an extent in 2014 with Sochi and Russia, and it just so happens to be all of those nations that like Western governments don't really like. So it does kind of feel like people are sort of accusing Beijing of being like a vehicle for the Chinese government to spread sort of propaganda. But I think equally to an extent, there's like propaganda being spread about China in other countries. So I guess another thing that I wanted to bring up and ask you guys was, I talked a little bit in the article about other places where there have been like huge issues that have gotten to host the Olympics. And it seems sort of like there is no way to have the Olympics without political controversy, without the host nation in some way being imperfect and, in many cases having done some like terrible, horrible things. So I guess I was wondering if you guys think is there a solution to that? Is there a way to fix that should nations get to host the Olympics even if they have a terrible human rights record?
Well, I think like you mentioned, like there's going to be an issue with near every host venue for the Olympics. I mean, whether it was, I remember the big thing in 2016 in Rio was just the economic state of the country and the housing situation in Brazil. And I'm not going to pretend like I'm informed enough on any of that to speak eloquently on it, but I do think the solution is probably to have just a neutral site for the Olympics. I think that's probably what would be the most kind of avoid the most controversy. But that being said, that then defeats pretty much the entire purpose of the Olympics. So it's sort of a catch-22 there. But yeah, I do think like no matter where the Olympics goes, there's going to be backlash that follows. I think is probably inevitable.
I have a slight hot take that I wanted to throw in. Sorry, Holly. Really quick, but I want both of your thoughts on it too. So that's why I wanted to mention it now. I don't think, yes, there's some performative justice stuff happening in sports lately, but I don't think the sports world, professional sports world, is a site where you're for justice like that. And it might come off a little harsh or a little cynical, but the Olympics were hosted in Nazi Germany, for crying out loud. I mean, there's no history of the Olympics being hosted in reputable places by reputable governments. It is a propaganda fest. If you choose to engage with that, you choose to engage with that. You should be aware that they are trying to sell you an image of their country, whoever is hosting it. That should be obvious, and that should be understood when people watch it. But yeah, I don't think this is a site of real justice. I know we're in a time when there's, the hope is that everything can be a force for good, and that we can pick apart the bad parts of everything and remove them, and the world will be perfect. But the Olympics have never been a site for that type of really progressive thought and really consistent moral action. So like I don't think it's, not to say it's not fair to put that on them. Like I guess that's a fair lens to look at it through. But I don't know, people coming to this as if like this is the first time of all of this happening, and like this is news to anyone. It just, I don't know. I share some of Holly's sentiments on it. I mean, I do support the diplomatic boycott of this Olympics, and I had at one point written that we should have pulled athletes as well. I have since kind of gone back on that, but I do support the diplomatic boycott because I do think that is fair. But I mean, the bar is low for the history of the Olympics, and so I don't think them hosting in China is grounds to say that they've reached some new low.
Yeah, that's kind of like exactly what I think too. Not like exactly, obviously there are some nuances that I might disagree on. But yeah, I think like at its core, and I'm not saying, like, I believe that, like, this is going to sound very schema of me, but I do believe that like the Olympic movement and Olympism and like the Olympics can be a good thing. They can, revitalize countries. They can help people's economies. They can be a force for good if they're used in the right way. I don't think that the International Olympic Committee, though, has ever been a force for good. But also, at the end of the day, I also believe that the way that people talk about China getting to host, pointing to their human rights records, and, nobody was saying this about Vancouver. Nobody is saying it about Paris. There was some discussion of like Sochi and Rio. But yeah, there's not really as much criticism of sort of Western developed countries as there is of what we sort of view as like the other countries. So yeah, I do think that the Olympics can be a good thing. I do think that there's value in the Olympics. I really like the Olympics, just to be totally honest. But I also believe that like the IOC does not ever have people's best interests at mind. But I also sort of like think that like countries where governments do bad things, that's not a reflection of the people. And I think to sort of isolate an entire people from the rest of the world and the things that we do, like to say like the Middle East can never have any mega sporting events because certain governments do bad things, and also it just so happens that like governments and political systems in Western countries don't like the Middle East. I think that to sort of exclude entire populations from just things that we do as like a society and as the Western world, I don't think that that is necessarily fair or particularly ethical, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what both of you are saying. I would also say that sports in general has the ability to spotlight, issues like the ones we're talking about. I probably agree with Noah in saying that the Olympics themselves probably aren't solving any problems or anything like that. But the other thing, Holly, I think you touched on it briefly, was just the fact that a lot of the recent Olympics have been held in non-Western countries, non-English speaking countries. You look at 2014 in Sochi, 2016, I guess, in Brazil, 2018 in, I think it was in Pyeongchang, and then Tokyo and Beijing most recently. I do wonder, maybe from my perspective, it could just be because I'm getting older and the Olympics fundamentally just mean a lot less to me now than they did when I was a kid. But I wonder how much of that meaning for other people, especially in North America, is because the Western world hasn't really hosted an Olympics since 2012 in London and 2010 in Vancouver. So I do think that has a lot to do with it as well, and just sort of the perceived devaluing of the Olympics, just so many of them being in different other parts of the world that are so different than ours.
So this week, one of our news editors, Devani Shah, wrote about Airbnb and a recent settlement that they reached in a class action lawsuit that was filed against them because they were not accurately showing customers the prices that they would actually be charged for rentals, as they would exclude certain fees, hide them from the initial listing. And so this is known as double ticketing, which is when a seller puts two or more prices on a product or service, and then the consumer is charged the higher price. This is illegal in Canada. Of course, I mean, we'll get into it, but the way that can actually be enforced is kind of tricky. But in this case, it kind of was almost enforced. A class action is a little bit different than actually, being found guilty. They were not found guilty of double ticketing. They did not admit any guilt whatsoever, but they will be providing a small settlement to people who booked with them between October 2015 and June 2019. So first off, are either of you going to be like $40 richer in Airbnb credits in the next few months?
I am not. I've actually never stayed at an Airbnb, so I will not be falling into that group.
I will also not be 40 Airbnb dollars richer. I have also never used Airbnb. I don't really intend to ever use Airbnb. I don't love the idea of staying in someone else's house.
Yeah, that is interesting. I've stayed in a few, but never. So, like, I know when it was kind of first a thing, at least I remember hearing about it. It was like, yeah, people were renting out their spare bedroom, or they were renting out their house that they live in because they were gone on vacation for a week. And so it was essentially like micro subletting in a way. But the reality is, which shouldn't necessarily be too surprising, is that it's essentially just turned into a way to avoid, the fees of like being part of like a larger network of rental vacation homes and things like that. Because the only times I've ever stayed in Airbnbs is on family vacations, where we've rented vacation homes, so homes that are specifically set out to be, rented and are not lived in, and renting, essentially like the equivalent of like the same thing, just in different locale for like different amounts of time. So just like a small like little vacation home type deals. But I don't think I've been the one to book them, so I don't think I'm going to be richer in Airbnb bucks either, sadly. But Ollie, you kind of brought it up. I'm curious, both of your thoughts on kind of this whole, like micro subletting market and like this Uber kind of approach to hotels and vacation booking. I'm curious if you guys have any hot takes on that, if that's you think is a good development, or something risky, as we've seen here, where rules are hard to enforce. I'm curious if you have any thoughts.
I don't love it. Like, you kind of called it the Uberification of things, and yeah, that's kind of what it is. Because it is really just sort of a way to dodge regulations that keep consumers and also workers safe. So that's probably one of the reasons why I'm not a fan of this kind of stuff. Like, I've definitely taken Ubers, I've definitely ordered delivery food, but Airbnb is just one that I have never really gotten behind. Yeah, I just think it's weird. I don't trust it, which might make me sound kind of like an old man. But yeah, I would rather just stay in a hotel.
Yeah, I don't really trust it either. But the other thing is I also don't really like go anywhere. I mean, I haven't been on vacation since I was, I think, 12 years old. So I haven't really had a reason to get an Airbnb at any time. But, it does make me think, you talk about Uberification, it does make me think, like, what's next? Taxis have been Uberified, and food delivery has been Uberified, and now hotels. And is there any other, like, industries that you think might be heading that way, or you think could be a potential to be headed that way?
Seems kind of like almost everything is trending in the like depersonalized and like against ownership kind of direction, where things are just kind of nebulous, and like you're paying for services that give you access to these things, but you never are. I mean, equity is a rich term, but essentially you're never you're never putting your money towards actually the ownership of something. It's always owned by these companies, and so you're just kind of working through middlemen through these like app service things. I think that's becoming extremely common. You know, Uber made that incredibly popularized, and kudos to them for that work. Even though I've written articles about my thoughts on them, but like for Airbnb in particular, like there's savings to be found here, and I think I get it from your guys' perspective who just haven't used it or like haven't gone on vacation, like you said, Liam. My family, so we make a point. I mean, other than in the last 2 years, to go down to Florida every year. But we are by no means wealthy. We by no means have a lot of money. There are a lot of us. So for a long time, when it was just me and my sisters, the five of us, we'd rent a condo. And I mean, after the economic crash in like 08, 09, that became really affordable to do because vacationing in Florida was hit really hard because there's a lot of Canadians that would go there. And so, the market was really chilled off by that. And so it was quite affordable to do that. That price was ever creeping up in the last few years. And I'd say it was 4 years ago, I think, the first time that my dad booked with Airbnb. And I think he paid under $2,000 for a house that sleeps like a dozen people for a week, which is a incredibly affordable price, much cheaper than we had paid for much smaller accommodations. And we were still working with a vacation rental company. They were just, instead of having their bookings go through another website, they were going through Airbnb, which was cheaper. Yes, Holly, you're right. It almost certainly means that there was less regulation on them, less that required them to hold things up to standard. But having not had any bad experiences yet, it's hard for me to, scoff at the radically lower prices, given the great experience that we've had personally. But I realize that is anecdotal. Structurally, I do agree with you that it would be better for the world that, this Uberification was not happening. But, as I know, as an individual economic actor, I can't make those types of changes myself. So I will take advantage of what is available in our actually dystopian world we live in. So now kind of going away from Airbnb specifically. So the issue that was at hand here was double ticketing, which, again, to reiterate, Airbnb was not found guilty of double ticketing. But similar, actions where, a seller might put a cheaper price to lure you in, and then you find the price with the fees at the end. Whether that is legally, definitionally double ticketing or not, I'm sure we've all seen that a lot. So I'm just curious, both of your thoughts on that. If that should be something that's gone away with, if you think double ticketing should be made, more stringent, right, to maybe catch more of that under that definition. If I'm just curious where you guys land on that.
I see it like a lot of the time with especially concert tickets. It happens to an extent with sports tickets, but less so, I think. Concert tickets are insane, and all of the extra fees that they'll put on. It's I'll go buy a cheap ticket for $20, and I'm like, woo, $20 concert. And then it's $5 handling fee and $5 delivery fee and I don't know, $5 venue fee, and the fees add up, and it's $50 to go see this $20 show. And it's also especially crazy because it's delivery fee, handling fee, when I am printing these tickets at home myself. I am doing the work here. So that is the thing that I have noticed, probably extra fees getting added on to all the time, and they add it in the same way that you'd add tax. So I don't think it's technically, definitionally, legally double ticketing, but it is definitely one of those circumstances where you think you're paying one amount and then you end up paying way more.
Yeah, I've noticed it as well. Like Holly was saying, mostly on tickets. I can remember going to Blue Jays games in the summer, and Like there was just always all these extra fees adding up. Probably not as many as concert tickets, but that's where I probably notice it the most. I've never felt it as like something that's inherently wrong or should be, more publicized or should be illegal or anything like this. And I think this is probably again, not double ticketing, but it's a less extreme case of extra fees being added on. But I've always just kind of seen it as annoying and just a bit of a hindrance more than anything. So I don't really. I mean, what would be an example of like a much bigger sort of double ticketing situation? Like what sorts of companies are we looking at here that might try to do that? I'm just not too informed on the whole process, whole concept.
That I think is the issue. I think it's unclear. I think the fact that we're all a little bit confused on exactly what double ticketing is versus like an actual mix up of like prices and whatnot, like or hidden fees, which I do not think qualify as double ticketing. Like I think it needs to be more clear. I do think that the law needs to be more clear because I do think there's a consumer protection angle to this that is important. I don't think the point is to like send someone from a company to jail for charging a price that has hidden fees or something like that, but it's more just making sure that it's communicated to people when they put in their credit card or when they agree to buy something that they might be charged for later, that the price that they agreed to is exactly the price. Like there should be no reason to have hidden fees. Like all fees should be required to be out in the open and clearly communicated to you. I think that's a fair consumer protection law to have on the books. It's just I can see why enforcement of that and even just defining that would be incredibly difficult. That does it for another episode of The Latest. Thank you, Holly and Liam, for joining me to talk about these great articles today, and thank you all for listening. We really appreciate it. Remember that you can find the full articles we talked about here today and many, many more by going to our website, www.brockpress.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at The Brock Press. On top of following us on social media, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, Breaker, Google Podcasts, and pretty much anywhere you're going to find your podcasts. Just be sure to look us up, The Latest, The Brock Press Podcast, and you should find us with no issues. You can also find the podcast on our YouTube channel and also on our website. With all that said, thanks again, and we will see you next time for another episode.